The winter air inside the den was still broken only by the heavy breathing of a mother black bear. She had curled her body into the dry leaves and pine needles she'd dragged inside weeks earlier, readying the chamber for the most important event of her year. Outside, the slopes of Shenandoah National Park were covered in a crust of snow. But inside this hollowed-out log, life was about to begin. By instinct alone, she knew the time had come. Hours passed, muscles contracted, and finally, tiny cries filled the darkness. One cub, then another, then a third. Each arrived wet, blind, and fragile, no larger than a chipmunk, yet immediately searching for warmth. They weighed just over half a pound, their survival depending entirely on her milk and her body heat. She pulled them close, pressing them against her belly, licking them clean. Then, after what seemed like an endless wait, a fourth arrived. This one was different, smaller, weaker. He trembled instead of crying. His legs moved like thin twigs in the cold air. When he reached for his mother's milk, the others pushed him aside. Black bear cubs are always born small, but this one carried a greater disadvantage. Biologists call them runts, the last born, or the underdeveloped. Many don't live past the first few days, not because the mother doesn't care, but because nature rarely allows space for weakness. It is harsh arithmetic in a winter den, only the strong usually make it. This tiny cub's odds were far slimmer than his siblings. The mother bear, however, didn't abandon him. She kept nudging him closer, trying to give him access to the warmest spot against her chest. Every few minutes, she shifted her massive paws, repositioning her body to shield him from drafts. To her, he was still hers, and instinct told her to keep trying. The struggle of the smallest had begun. For rangers like Daniel Carter, stories like this were not just science, but everyday reality. Daniel had worked these mountains for 2 decades, and every winter he would track known den sites, careful not to disturb, but always monitoring signs of survival. He knew the statistics: a healthy black bear mother in Appalachia might give birth to 2 or 3 cubs every other year, and most of them would live. But when a runt appeared, survival dropped dramatically. Cubs need to double or triple their weight in the first months of life. If they can't nurse enough, hypothermia or starvation ends their lives quickly. Daniel had once found the remains of a runt cub outside a den carried away by scavengers. The memory never left him. It was a reminder of how thin the line is between life and death in the wild. Still, the appearance of a runt wasn't just a tragedy, it was a mirror of nature's quiet rules. Every spring, when Daniel reported cub survival rates, he also saw how adaptable black bears could be. A mother that lost one cub often gave the others a better chance. The cycle balanced itself, cruel but efficient. Yet this particular story was about to challenge those rules in a way no one could have predicted. If you've ever raised a litter of puppies or kittens, you may have seen a runt too. They are often the ones that need to be hand-fed, tucked into blankets, and given second chances by human caretakers. The difference in the wild is that there is no warm blanket, no bottle, no second chance unless fate intervenes. Watching a runt fight to live teaches something subtle. Survival isn't only about strength. Sometimes it's about persistence, and sometimes it's about the choices of those around you. In the den that night, the weakest cub tried again. He crawled over his siblings, pressing his tiny muzzle toward the mother's belly. Again, he was shoved aside. Again, he tried. His faint squeak barely registered in the still air, but he was there, holding on. For 3 days, he fought. And for 3 days, the mother bear tried everything her instincts provided, licking him, keeping him closer, shifting positions to allow him access, yet each passing hour drained his body more. His heartbeat slowed, his temperature dropped. The odds tightened around him like a noose. Black bear biology explains this mercilessly. Cubs are born during hibernation when their mothers are fasting. She has no way to hunt or feed herself during these months. Her fat reserves must sustain both her and her litter until spring. That's why her milk is so rich, nearly 30% fat, far more than cow's milk. The stronger cubs drink first, and they drink the most. The weaker cub falls behind, not because the mother doesn't want him, but because her body cannot create an endless supply. It is a system built for efficiency, not mercy. For Daniel, hearing later about what happened next would feel almost impossible. In his years of service, he had read reports of mountain lions appearing near ranch houses with injured paws or coyotes lingering near human camps when wounded. But a black bear mother carrying her newborn cub to the edge of human presence, that was unheard of. He would remember that morning forever, but to understand it, one has to sit with the scene inside that den. A mother is trying everything. A cub growing weaker by the hour. A choice that would not be made by thought, but by instinct, an instinct no one expected. And here lies a small lesson, one that applies beyond wildlife. We sometimes imagine nature as brutal and unforgiving, but it is also full of unpredictable mercy. A mother bear had no handbook, no plan, no words. She only had instinct, and in this case, instinct told her to act outside the usual script. That's the mystery at the heart of this story. Was it desperation? A mistake or something deeper? A recognition that survival might only come through intervention beyond the forest? We cannot know. But what we can say is this. The smallest cub, who had little chance of surviving, was about to become the center of a story that would carry lessons far beyond one den in Virginia. This is not just about one cub's fight for life. It's also about how humans, when faced with such moments, must decide whether to step in or step back. Do we respect nature's course, or do we create a bridge of compassion between species? That question begins here with the cry of a runt in a winter den and a mother bear making a choice. No one thought possible. In the chapters ahead, we'll follow what happens when that cub leaves the den, not in the grip of his mother's jaws, but in the hands of a ranger stunned by what he just witnessed. The story shifts from instinct to intervention, and the struggle of the smallest becomes the responsibility of an entire community. At dawn, the ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains held a silence that only winter can bring. Snow clung to the branches, but in the valley below, something unusual was unfolding. The mother black bear left her den. That in itself was a violation of instinct. Bears in hibernation rarely move far in midwinter, and mothers with newborn cubs rarely leave the safety of cover. Yet she moved anyway, her head low, her mouth carrying something fragile. The smallest cub dangled between her jaws, too weak to protest. Every few steps she paused, glancing back toward the den. Her other 3 cubs remained hidden in the hollow, their lives now tethered to the hope she would return. She pressed forward through the brush, driven by an urge that science cannot fully explain. She was approaching the edge of human territory. Daniel Carter was beginning his morning shift at the ranger station just a few miles away. He checked radio messages, poured coffee into a paper cup, and flipped through his notebook of overnight reports. Mostly uneventful. A downed tree on Skyline Drive, tracks of a coyote spotted near a campsite, nothing unusual. He had no idea his life was about to change. From the tree line, the bear emerged. Daniel saw movement first, a shadow crossing the snow. His hand moved instinctively to his binoculars. What he saw froze him in place. A black bear mother, gaunt from hibernation, is moving toward the ranger outpost with deliberate steps. He had studied black bear behavior for years, guided tourists, handled conflict reports, and written safety protocols. Nothing in his training covered this. A wild animal was breaking every rule by moving closer instead of fleeing. When she stopped just beyond the clearing, he noticed what she carried. A cub. Small. Limp. Daniel's breath caught. She placed the cub gently at the edge of the clearing, not inside the station, not in reach of the humans, but just close enough. For a moment, her golden brown eyes lifted to meet his. It was not a look of fear nor aggression. It was a stillness, a communication that had no words. Then, without sound, she turned and vanished into the forest. This single action raises questions that wildlife scientists still debate. Was it desperation, a final attempt, when instinct told her the cub was lost? Or was it something beyond survival, an intuitive recognition that humans might offer what she could not? We cannot ask her, and we cannot know for certain. What we can say is that this behavior is vanishingly rare. Black bears are notorious for avoiding people. Mothers especially defend their cubs fiercely. For one, to leave her weakest cub near humans defies nearly every known pattern. There are examples in the wild of animals approaching humans in moments of crisis. Lions have been seen circling vehicles when injured. Dolphins have carried entangled calves near fishing boats as if requesting help. Elephants, wounded by poachers, have been known to walk into villages bleeding their pain, too great to bear alone. But a black bear in Virginia, entrusting her newborn cub to a ranger that had no precedent Daniel could recall. As he crouched in the snow, Daniel's first instinct was caution. Approaching a bear cub without knowing the mother's distance is dangerous. He scanned the tree line, his heart racing every nerve, reminding him that a protective mother might charge at any second. Yet minutes passed and no shadow returned. The cub gave a faint squeak, barely audible, his body trembling from cold. Daniel removed his gloves and felt the tiny frame lighter than he expected, so fragile it seemed it could vanish in his palm. He wrapped the cub inside his jacket against his chest and whispered as if the cub could understand. "All right, little one. You're safe now." This choice, the mother's to walk away and Daniel's to step forward, illustrates a deeper truth about the human-animal relationship. We often imagine a wall between us and the wild one that should not be crossed. Yet in extraordinary moments, instinct finds cracks in that wall. A mother bear had no rational understanding of ranger stations, wildlife rehabilitation, or incubators. But she acted in a way that placed trust where none should exist. And in return, a ranger set aside protocol and fear, responding not as an officer of the park, but as a caretaker. Survival is not always a solo effort. In nature and in life, survival often depends on unlikely alliances. The bear's choice seems unthinkable. But maybe that is because we underestimate the depth of instinct, the possibility that wild animals sense more than we give them credit for. From a scientific perspective, biologists might call it desperation behavior. The last act of a mother who knew the cub would not make it in the den. From a personal perspective, Daniel later described it as a moment of silent understanding. He would never know why she chose that course, but he believed she had sensed something in him, something that carried the possibility of mercy. For viewers and readers, this offers a fresh perspective. We often frame wild animals as separate, untouchable, ruled by biology alone. But stories like this remind us that the boundary between instinct and connection is thinner than we think. Compassion may not be exclusive to humans. Sometimes it appears in forms we struggle to define: an elephant refusing to leave a fallen matriarch, a wolf bringing food to an injured packmate, or a mother bear leaving her cub in human care. As Daniel carried the cub inside, wrapping it in a wool blanket, his radio crackled with routine chatter. He didn't answer. The weight in his arms demanded all his focus. The cub's heartbeat was weak, its breathing shallow. There was no time for debate. He placed a quick call to the Blue Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, telling them to prepare for immediate intake. Dr. Emily Foster's calm voice on the other end gave him instructions. Keep the cub warm, keep it close, drive fast. Before starting the engine, Daniel paused once more, looking out into the trees where the mother had vanished. He knew she would not return. Her choice was final. He whispered to the empty forest, "I'll do my best." Then he drove, snow spraying behind the tires, one hand on the wheel, the other pressed to the fragile life beneath his coat. It is tempting to interpret the bear's choice as a story only about her, but it also reframes Daniel's life. Until that morning, his work was about enforcing rules, keeping hikers safe, issuing fines for illegal camping, and repairing trails. Necessary tasks, but distant from the raw heartbeat of the wild. Now he was pulled directly into the survival of one cub, entrusted not by regulation but by instinct. That shift would ripple through everything he did afterward. In a broader sense, this event raises the timeless question, should humans intervene in wild survival? Some argue that intervention distorts natural selection, weakening future generations. Others believe compassion obliges us to step in when we can, especially when human encroachment has already altered the odds. There is no single answer, but the debate itself is vital. It keeps us honest about the role we play in shaping the survival of wild animals. The cub, now named River by the rehabilitation staff, became part of that ongoing conversation. His survival was no longer the responsibility of his mother, but of humans who had to weigh science, ethics, and compassion in equal measure. And so the story shifts. From the mysterious choice of a mother bear, we move into the hands of a veterinary team facing their own unthinkable challenge: how to raise a wild cub without breaking the very instincts that make him a bear. That is where our story goes next, into the sterile lights and urgent decisions of the wildlife hospital, where River's fight for life truly begins. The drive from the ranger station to the Blue Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center usually took 40 minutes. That morning, with snow sliding off the hood of the truck and a cub cradled against his chest, Daniel made it in 30. He had no time to think. Every sound from the bundle inside his jacket, the faint squeaks, the shallow breaths, kept his foot pressed on the accelerator. He remembered Dr. Emily Foster's calm voice over the radio, guiding him like a lifeline. "Keep him warm. Don't let his temperature drop. We'll be ready." Emily was waiting at the entrance. Years of practice had taught her how to handle emergencies without hesitation. She took the cub, gently weighed him, and placed him in an incubator that hummed with heat. The numbers told the story quickly. Too cold, too dehydrated, underweight by nearly a third compared to a healthy black bear cub. His heartbeat when pressed against the stethoscope was irregular. "We'll need to stabilize him first," Emily said, already motioning to her assistants. "Fluids, glucose, antibiotics in case of infection, small doses only." Daniel stood back, torn between wanting to help and knowing he had no medical training. His hands shook as he watched. For years, his work as a ranger had been about prevention, keeping people away from bears, discouraging tourists from leaving food-tracking population numbers. Now, for the first time, he was staring at a life-and-death struggle measured in milliliters and heartbeats. Hand-raising a wild cub is not like rescuing a puppy. Veterinary science makes that clear. Cubs this young face a storm of risks. Their immune systems are fragile, their digestive tracts unprepared for substitutes, their chances of imprinting on humans dangerously high. Emily explained quietly while adjusting an IV. If he associates people with food, he may never survive in the wild. We have to care for him, but also keep him wild. That balance, saving a life while protecting its nature, would define the months ahead. Examples from other rescues gave weight to her caution. She recalled a case of a grizzly cub in Montana, hand-fed too often in direct human contact. When released, it returned to campsites associating people with food. It had to be captured again, this time for permanent sanctuary. Another story came from a wolf pup in Minnesota, saved at first, but imprinted so strongly that it paced against fences, desperate for human touch. Rescue without discipline can turn survival into captivity. River, as the staff began to call him, was at risk of the same fate. Every feeding had to be carefully planned. A special milk replacer designed to mimic the fat-rich composition of a mother bear's milk was delivered in small amounts through a tube at first. His body was too weak to nurse. The incubator provided the warmth that his mother's body once gave. Antibiotics and glucose kept him alive through the night. And every moment, Emily and her team wore gloves, avoided unnecessary talking, and minimized touch. Saving him meant resisting the very instincts of comfort humans normally give infants. For Daniel, this was both heartbreaking and humbling. He wanted to hold River, to speak to him, to reassure him, but Emily's rule was firm. We are not his parents. We are only his bridge. The lesson was clear. Sometimes compassion means holding back, not giving in. It's a paradox that reaches beyond wildlife. Help often requires restraint. Still, Daniel found ways to contribute. He volunteered to monitor the cub's breathing at night, logging temperature changes every hour, alerting Emily if anything shifted. In those quiet hours, listening to the rise and fall of tiny lungs, he felt a connection that words could not capture. The forest outside was silent, but in that small room, life hung by a thread, and he was part of the thread's strength. This fresh perspective challenged the way he saw his role as a ranger. Protecting bears had always been about boundaries, keeping humans on one side, wildlife on the other. Now he was part of a fragile overlap where those boundaries blurred. and he began to understand conservation is not only about keeping distance. Sometimes it is about entering the gap when instinct and survival no longer align. Over the next week, River's condition wavered like a flame in the wind. One night, his temperature dropped suddenly. Alarms sounded on the incubator, and Emily rushed in, adjusting fluids, increasing heat, whispering instructions to the team. Daniel watched as her calm turned into urgency, then back into calm as the numbers stabilized. "This is the edge we live on," she said afterward. "Every cub like this walks it. Our job is to guide them across without leaving our footprint on them." By the 10th day, River opened his eyes. Small, dark, and unfocused, they searched the space around him. He whimpered, not from weakness this time, but from hunger. He took his first drops of milk from a specialized bottle, latching clumsily, yet holding on. Daniel leaned against the wall, exhausted but smiling for the first time since the mother bear vanished into the trees. Against the odds, River had begun to fight back. That milestone carried both hope and responsibility. Each gram gained was celebrated quietly, each moment of play, a sign his instincts were awakening, but Emily reminded them daily. "We are raising him for the wild, not for ourselves." It was a mantra repeated until it became part of Daniel's thoughts too. The lesson here is not limited to black bears. It mirrors the work of every wildlife rehabilitation effort. Whether it is a sea turtle hatchling returned to the ocean, a bald eagle released back to the sky, or a fox limping free after treatment, the principle is the same: intervention is temporary. The goal is always independence. There is mystery too, the kind that no science fully explains. Did River's mother know this was possible? Did she sense humans could step in where she could not? Or was it a desperate act without expectation, an instinctive gesture that accidentally opened a door? The answer will never be known. But River's heartbeat in that incubator was proof that her choice, however unexplainable, had meaning. As days turned into weeks, Daniel's life shifted permanently. He spent more nights at the rehabilitation center than at his ranger station. He learned to read subtle signs, how a twitch in River's ear indicated stress, how the rhythm of his breathing revealed more than any machine. And he realized something about himself. He was not only protecting bears anymore, he was learning from them. Resilience, patience, the power of trust built without words. That realization would lead to the next stage of the journey. Because once River gained strength, the challenge would grow more complex. Feeding him was only the beginning. Teaching him to be wild again without erasing the instincts he needed for survival was a greater task. And it was one Daniel was not sure he was ready for. Daniel Carter had spent 2 decades in uniform. His job as a ranger meant boundaries between humans and bears, between the safe and the dangerous, between the rules and the exceptions. Most days were about writing citations, repairing fences, or guiding visitors away from trails where black bears had been spotted. His radio was always on his pen, always ready to record violations. He thought of himself as a protector of order, not a caretaker of individuals. But River, the small black bear cub, now struggling to grow stronger in the rehabilitation center, was erasing that line. Daniel found himself returning to the clinic after shifts, trading his ranger hat for latex gloves, his notepad for feeding logs. What began as a single emergency transport had become a daily ritual. He would arrive at dusk, sit beside the incubator, and quietly monitor the cub's breathing while the medical staff handled treatments. At first, he told himself it was duty. After all, he had been the one to receive the cub from the mother. It was his responsibility to see the case through. Yet deep down, the truth was different. River had stirred something in him that the forests and the patrols never had. Grief was part of it. Years earlier, Daniel had lost his only son in a car accident. It was a wound that had never healed, hidden beneath the routines of ranger life. He had thrown himself into long shifts and solitary hikes, convincing himself that solitude was strength. But as he sat in that clinic, watching River's chest rise and fall, he felt echoes of a heartbeat he once listened to at his son's bedside. The connection was wordless, but undeniable. Emily noticed his dedication. One evening, she handed him the thermometer and asked him to record River's temperature every hour through the night. "If you're going to be here anyway," she said with a half smile, "you might as well help." From then on, Daniel became part of the team. He learned to measure fluids, to record weights, and to adjust the warmth of the incubator. Every action was small, but together they created a rhythm of care. For a man trained to enforce distance from wildlife, this was a transformation. Rangers are taught to never anthropomorphize, to never step beyond their role as guardians of space and safety. Yet here he was, whispering encouragement to a cub, waiting anxiously for each feeding to succeed, feeling relief when River latched onto the bottle. The ranger who once warned campers against feeding wild animals was now celebrating every drop swallowed. This paradox holds a lesson. Sometimes the roles we define for ourselves, protector, enforcer, rule keeper, are not the only roles we are capable of. Circumstances can draw out hidden capacities, reshaping our identity. For Daniel, it was the realization that law and compassion were not opposites. They could coexist, even strengthen each other. By stepping into caregiving, he was not abandoning his ranger's oath. He was fulfilling it more deeply, protecting not just populations, but one life entrusted to him. There are parallels in other professions. A firefighter may spend years putting out blazes in empty structures only to discover a new sense of purpose the first time a child is pulled from smoke. A doctor may treat hundreds of patients from a distance, but everything changes when one case resonates with their personal history. Transformation often begins at the intersection of duty and emotion. Daniel's colleagues noticed changes in him too. He became quieter during patrols, more reflective during meetings. When reports of black bears raiding garbage bins came in, he argued for solutions that emphasized coexistence rather than punishment. He began to advocate for more educational programs, more community outreach. His perspective was shifting from enforcement to empathy, from statistics to stories. River had become the lens through which he saw the entire population of bears in the Appalachians. One evening, while cleaning feeding bottles, Daniel confided in Emily. "I've spent years telling people to leave bears alone. Now I'm spending every night hoping this one survives because of us. Feels like I've crossed some line." Emily looked at him thoughtfully. "Maybe the line isn't as fixed as you think. Conservation isn't about absence, it's about balance. Sometimes balance requires stepping in." Her words gave him a fresh perspective. Protecting wildlife was not only about distance. It was about discernment, knowing when to stay back and when to step forward. The mother bear had made her choice at the edge of that line, leaving River in human care. Now it was Daniel's turn to honor that choice, not just with enforcement, but with compassion. River's progress mirrored Daniel's transformation. The cub gained weight, his eyes grew clearer, and his movements stronger. He began to paw at the sides of his enclosure, testing his legs, demanding more space. Daniel, once content to monitor quietly, now helped prepare enrichment activities, hiding food in logs, placing scents in corners to stimulate River's instincts. He was learning alongside the cub how to nurture without taming, how to guide without controlling. The example of River's journey spread beyond the clinic walls. Local volunteers came to watch, inspired by the story of the cub whose mother had entrusted him to humans. Daniel often stood in the background, uncomfortable with attention, but quietly proud. He realized that stories of individual animals carried power. Data about black bear populations could inform, but stories like River's could transform hearts. There is a small lesson in that recognition. People connect more deeply to narratives than to numbers. A single cub fighting to survive can shift perspectives about an entire species. For conservation to succeed, it must speak not only to the mind, but to the heart. Daniel's transformation was not complete, though. He still carried doubts. Was he doing the right thing by becoming so involved? Was he risking River's wildness by letting personal grief shape his actions? These questions haunted him at night. But each morning, when he saw River lift his head, blink his dark eyes, and reach for the bottle, the doubts eased. Life itself was justification enough. This inner conflict between duty and emotion, enforcement and care, was shaping the man Daniel was becoming. And it prepared him for the next phase one that would stretch both his role and River's survival even further. Because feeding and stabilizing were only the beginning. The true challenge was ahead, teaching River how to be a bear again, preparing him for a life in the wild he had never known. That task required more than medicine, more than compassion. It required strategy, discipline, and a willingness to let go. And as Daniel would soon learn, letting go was the hardest transformation of all. River survived the fragile months of infancy. His weight increased, his eyes focused, and his small paws gripped the edges of his enclosure with new strength. But survival in a clinic was not the same as survival in the forest. Daniel and Dr. Emily Foster knew that the next chapter was more complicated. River had to become what he was meant to be, a black bear living free in the mountains. The challenge was simple to describe, but difficult to execute. How do you raise a cub with human help without letting him depend on humans? Veterinary science has developed methods to balance care with wildness. Gloves mask human scent, food is hidden in logs or buried in soil, and contact is minimized whenever possible. The goal is to awaken instincts, not replace them. Daniel learned quickly that restraint was as important as action. When River cried out, he wanted to comfort him, but Emily reminded him, every moment of comfort from us is a moment taken from his wild future. So instead of holding the cub, Daniel created challenges. He placed apples inside hollow stumps, scattered berries among piles of leaves, and rolled logs filled with insects into the enclosure. River sniffed, pawed, scratched, and discovered. What began as clumsy swats turned into deliberate foraging. There were setbacks. One afternoon, River ignored the log enrichment and pressed himself against the fence, watching Daniel instead of the food. It was a moment of warning. Imprinting, the risk of associating humans with security was always present. Emily pulled Daniel aside. If he grows up looking to you instead of the forest, we've failed him. Daniel carried those words heavily. From then on, he limited his presence, hiding food without River seeing, observing from blinds instead of standing nearby. Other wildlife stories reinforced the importance of discipline. In Montana, a hand-raised grizzly cub had been released too soon, only to return to campsites for scraps. The bear was eventually euthanized, a tragedy rooted in too much familiarity. In Alaska, orphaned wolf pups had been bottle-fed without barriers. They later sought out human contact and never adapted to the pack. These failures reminded Daniel and Emily of the stakes. Saving River's life meant resisting their own need for closeness. Yet progress was undeniable. River's claws grew sharper with practice, his nose keener with every hidden scent. He began to climb small trees within the enclosure, gripping the bark with surprising strength. He wrestled with logs, dragged branches across the ground, and even practiced mock charges against shadows. Instinct once dormant was rising. There is a lesson in this. Growth often requires distance. Just as a child eventually learns to walk without a parent's hand, a cub must learn to survive without the constant presence of caretakers. Letting go gradually is not neglect, it is preparation. Daniel, who once wanted to cradle River at every sign of weakness, began to understand that stepping back was also an act of love. The transformation wasn't only in River. Daniel's identity as a ranger was evolving too. He used to think his job ended with protection, keeping people away from bears, enforcing the law. Now he saw it differently. Protection also meant equipping wild creatures with the skills they needed to thrive without humans. His role had become less about enforcement and more about mentorship, though the pupil could never know his name. This fresh perspective shaped his daily actions. He no longer saw River as a dependent animal, but as a future resident of the forest. Every log he placed, every scent he scattered was part of a curriculum designed to awaken instincts older than memory. The process was humbling. It reminded him that humans are not creators of wildlife, only facilitators of its return. Community voices soon entered the story. News of the cubs spread, and locals debated the value of such efforts. Some supported the rescue, touched by the image of a mother bear entrusting her cub. Others argued that resources should go to human needs, not to a single animal with uncertain odds. Daniel listened quietly at town meetings, understanding both sides. He knew that black bears were not endangered nationwide, but in regions like Appalachia, they faced threats from shrinking habitats and road collisions. Each cub that returned to the forest was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that coexistence was possible. Comparisons helped frame the conversation. Just as sea turtle hatchlings in Florida are guided to the ocean or bald eagles are nursed back to flight, River's journey was part of a larger tradition of animal rescue. Each story teaches communities that compassion and science can work together even when outcomes are uncertain. River's story simply happened to unfold in their backyard. As months passed, River grew stronger. He learned to tear open logs for grubs, to climb higher trees, to retreat to dens when startled. Daniel and Emily gradually increased the complexity of challenges. Larger enclosures live prey. Introductions like field mice and less predictable feeding schedules. Each success was a step toward independence. But Daniel also saw the emotional cost. The more River grew into a bear, the less he could interact with him. He missed the early days of whispered encouragement, the moments of eye contact through the incubator glass. Now contact had to be distant, almost invisible. It was a form of loss, but also a form of trust. River no longer needed him as a figure of safety, and that was the goal all along. There is mystery in watching instincts awaken. Where did River learn to swat at prey, to climb, to dig? No human had shown him. These actions were written into him long before birth, waiting only for the right environment to surface. It reminded Daniel that wildness is not something humans give. It is something animals already carry, and our role is simply to protect the conditions that let it flourish. By the time River reached his first full year, he was nearly unrecognizable from the frail cub Daniel once held against his chest. His weight approached healthy averages. His coat shone thick and dark, and his movements carried confidence. He was finally becoming a black bear again. Yet, the journey was not over. Teaching him to be wild within fences was one thing. Preparing him to live without those fences was another. The next step required more than skill building. It required space risk and the acceptance that humans could only guide so far. For Daniel, the thought was both proud and painful. He had poured months of care into this cub, and soon the forest would test everything. There would be no incubator, no feeding logs, no ranger standing nearby. Only the mountains, the rivers, and the instincts of a young bear who had been given a second chance. And so the story turns again. From teaching River in controlled enclosures, the work would expand into creating a larger semi-wild sanctuary where he could prepare for true release. Building such a haven was not easy. It meant navigating bureaucracy, finding funding, and convincing skeptics. But it was the only way forward. Love for the wild is not possession, it is preparation for letting go. And Daniel was about to learn that on a scale far bigger than one enclosure. The River had grown beyond the small enclosure. He climbed trees, foraged, and swatted at shadows with confidence. The rehabilitation center had done all it could within its walls, but Daniel and Dr. Emily Foster knew the next step was critical. To prepare a River for release, they needed a space larger than cages, wilder than pens, but still secure enough for monitoring. They needed a haven, an in-between world where a black bear cub could practice being wild before returning fully to the mountains. Creating such a place was not as simple as unlocking a gate. It required land funding permits and, above all, a clear plan. Sanctuaries and semi-wild rehabilitation areas are rare in the United States because they demand balance, too much human control, and the bear never learns independence. Too little oversight and survival risks rise. Daniel stepped into this challenge without a manual, guided only by determination and the silent trust of a cub who had already beaten impossible odds. The first obstacle was money. Building a fenced valley, installing camera traps, and providing veterinary access required thousands of dollars. Daniel sold his truck and put his savings into the project, but it wasn't enough. Emily reached out to conservation groups, and soon local news stations picked up the story of the cub rescued by a mother's extraordinary choice. Donations trickled in from schools, wildlife photographers, and families who had seen black bears wander near their backyards. Each contribution, no matter how small, carried the same message: River's survival mattered. But support wasn't universal. At town meetings, some argued that investing in one bear was wasteful. Why put resources into a single cub when people in this county struggle to pay bills? One resident asked. Daniel listened quietly, acknowledging the concern. He explained that the haven wasn't just about River. It was about research, education, and preparing for future rescues. It was about showing that humans could choose coexistence over conflict. Still, opposition reminded him that conservation is never only about animals. It is also about people politics and priorities. The permits were another battle. State wildlife officials demanded detailed plans, fence specifications, escape prevention, and disease monitoring. Every document required signatures, inspections, and revisions. Weeks stretched into months. At times, Daniel felt crushed by bureaucracy. But each night when he returned to the clinic and saw River dragging branches across the enclosure or pawing at hidden food, he remembered why he persisted. Paperwork was frustrating, but a cub's future was worth the fight. Finally, after nearly a year of planning, the haven opened. 50 acres of mixed forest and meadow bordered by a secure fence that blended with the landscape. Streams trickled through the valley and natural dens dotted the slopes. Hidden cameras monitored every movement, while feeding stations were camouflaged to avoid human association. It wasn't pure wilderness, but it was close enough to test instincts. The first day River entered the haven, Daniel and Emily held their breath. They watched from a blind as the gate opened. River sniffed the ground, hesitated, then stepped forward. He climbed the nearest oak, swayed on a branch, then dropped to the ground and ran across the clearing with a freedom he had never known. Watching him, Daniel felt a mix of pride and sadness. Pride because River was finally stepping toward the life he was meant for. Sadness because every step away from dependence on humans was also a step away from him. The haven became River's classroom. Food was hidden under rocks. Scents of wild animals were introduced, and live prey like rabbits tested his hunting ability. At first, he fumbled, chasing without success. But over time, patience and precision emerged. His claws gripped better, his timing sharpened, and his muscles grew leaner. Each success meant less need for human provisioning. Each failure meant another chance to learn resilience. There is a lesson in this process. Building independence often requires controlled struggle. Just as children learn resilience by solving problems without immediate rescue, wild cubs grow stronger when allowed to fail safely. Daniel realized that his role wasn't to shield River from difficulty, but to create conditions where difficulty could teach. Other animals had walked similar paths. Cheetah cubs in South Africa were placed in semi-wild reserves before release, learning to stalk gazelles under supervision. Orphaned orangutans in Borneo practiced climbing in forest schools before facing the canopy alone. Each program proved the same principle. Freedom must be rehearsed before it can be lived. River's haven was part of that global pattern, an Appalachian version of second chances. But Daniel also saw the mystery in it. Watching River stalk prey or climb trees, he wondered, how did a cub raised by humans rediscover instincts never taught? Where did the knowledge sleep before it awoke? Science can explain genetics, but it cannot fully capture the wonder of wildness resurfacing after months of human care. That mystery humbled him, reminding him that humans don't create wildlife. We only protect the spark already within it. The haven's success soon drew attention. Students visited on field trips, learning about black bears' habitat loss and the challenges of coexistence. Researchers studied the river's behavior through the cameras, gathering data on rewilding methods. Local farmers, who once complained about bears raiding orchards, began attending workshops on coexistence, seeing River as proof that management could work. Slowly, the story shifted from one cub to an entire community, re-evaluating its relationship with the forest. Yet, challenges remained. Maintaining the haven required constant funding, repairs to fencing after storms, and vigilance against disease. Some critics still argued it was an expensive experiment. Daniel often carried those doubts late at night, walking the perimeter fence with a flashlight, listening for River's distant movements in the dark. Was it enough? Was he preparing River for freedom or delaying the inevitable? The answer came gradually by. Not in words, but in River's actions. He stopped waiting near the feeding stations, relying instead on his own hunting. He marked trees with his claws, claiming space as a wild bear. He ignored the cameras focused entirely on the rhythm of the forest. He was no longer the cub who once whimpered in an incubator. He was becoming something beyond Daniel's reach. True care is not measured by how long we hold on, but by how well we prepare to let go. Building the haven was not about keeping River close. It was about giving him a place to outgrow the need for humans. This realization offered Daniel a fresh perspective on his own life. He thought of his late son, of the grief that once kept him from opening up. Caring for River had not erased that pain, but it had transformed it. It taught him that love is not possession, it is preparation for independence, even if independence means distance. And so the haven became both River's training ground and Daniel's reminder of purpose. Each day brought them closer to the same truth. The fence was not the end, but a threshold. Beyond it lay mountains, rivers, and the unknown, which is where the story now turns. Because the haven was never meant to be permanent, the true test of everything, every late night, every feeding, every hidden log and patient lesson was release. The moment River would leave the fence behind and step fully into the forest. That day was coming, and with it, the hardest choice Daniel had ever faced, to let River go and trust that the wild would accept him. The day came when the fence could no longer define River's world. He had grown too confident, too restless, his movements signaling readiness. Daniel and Dr. Emily Foster knew they could not postpone forever. The haven had served its purpose, but wild instincts could only stretch so far inside borders. Now it was time for the real test, releasing a black bear cub, raised by humans, back into the forest where he belonged. Preparation for release was meticulous. A GPS collar was fitted around River's neck, lightweight but durable, transmitting location data to satellites. Camera traps were set in areas where he might roam, offering glimpses into his adaptation. These tools were not about control, but about knowledge, ways to track survival, study progress, and learn from success or failure. For biologists, every release is also an experiment, one that informs the future of wildlife rescue. Deep within the George Washington National Forest, far from towns and highways, but rich in acorns, berries, and streams. The area already supported a healthy population of black bears, meaning River would face both opportunity and competition. It was the kind of landscape where a bear could test his instincts without immediate risk from humans. On the morning of release, Daniel drove with River in a transport crate secured in the back of the truck. The road wound through towering trees, sunlight flickering across the windshield. Each bump on the dirt track rattled the crate, but River remained calm, shifting his weight slowly, snuffling at the air. Perhaps he sensed the change coming. At the site, the team worked quietly. The crate was positioned near the tree line. Cameras rolled, but no one spoke loudly. Daniel crouched by the door, his hand on the latch. For a moment, memories flooded him, the first time he held River's fragile body against his chest, the nights monitoring his breathing, the struggles to keep him wild yet alive. Letting go now felt like lifting a weight and placing it on the unknown. He pulled the latch. The door swung open. River hesitated, stepping out cautiously, nose raised, testing scents carried by the wind. He took a few steps, turned his head once toward the humans, then moved forward. His body lowered into a familiar bear gait, paws pressing the earth with quiet authority. Within moments, he disappeared into the undergrowth. The forest swallowed him without ceremony. The silence afterward was heavy. Daniel felt both pride and loss emotions so mixed he could not separate them. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is what we worked for," she said. "Silence means he belongs out there." That silence carried meaning. Release is rarely dramatic. There are no final goodbyes, no recognition of human sacrifice. There is only the quiet departure of a wild animal reclaiming his birthright. The lesson is simple but profound. The measure of success is not how much the animal remembers us, but how quickly he forgets. Monitoring began immediately. The GPS collar sent signals every few hours, mapping River's journey. At first, he moved cautiously, circling near the release site, exploring streams and oak groves. His first week showed short movements, typical of a bear learning new territory. Then came longer forays, stretching into valleys and ridges. Each ping brought relief. He was alive, mobile, adapting. There were close calls. One signal indicated he had lingered near a road. Daniel drove out in worry, scanning the area until the collar showed River had moved back into the deeper forest. Another time, the cameras captured him chasing a rabbit, clumsy at first but persistent. Weeks later, a new clip showed him dragging a branch heavy with acorns, proof that foraging instincts were intact. Examples from other releases offered context. In Alaska, an orphaned brown bear had been reintroduced only to clash fatally with dominant males. In Florida, a rehabilitated panther struggled with hunting and had to be recaptured. Survival was never guaranteed, but River's progress suggested hope. He was cautious, adaptive, not reckless. The mystery lay in how seamlessly he seemed to blend back into the forest. A cub, once fed by bottles, was now stalking prey-marking trees and sleeping in dens of his own making. How do instincts resurface so fully after months of human care? Science points to genetics, but Daniel believed something more was at work. A resilience written deep within wild creatures ready to rise when given the chance. For Daniel, each data point carried more than scientific value. It carried personal meaning. Every successful hunt, every mile traveled, was a reminder that grief could be transformed into purpose. He had once lost a son, but through Reeve, he found a way to channel that pain into life instead of silence. The forest now held not only memories of loss, but also the ongoing story of a bear learning to survive. The community followed the updates with interest. Local schools plotted River's GPS locations on maps, learning about bear ranges and food sources. Farmers discussed coexistence strategies, understanding that one bear's journey reflected broader patterns of wildlife movement. River became more than an individual. He became a living bridge between humans and the forest around them. There is a small lesson in this one that resonates beyond conservation. Letting go is not the end of connection. It is the beginning of trust. Whether it is raising children, mentoring others, or releasing a wild cub, the moment of stepping back is both painful and necessary. Freedom cannot exist without distance. Months passed. River survived his first winter in the wild, his collar showing a pattern of reduced movement typical of denning. When spring came, he emerged lean but alive, covering more ground than ever. Camera traps captured him near berry patches, sometimes alone, sometimes in proximity to other bears. One image showed him lying in tall grass near a larger female. No signs of aggression. Perhaps Daniel thought a sign of acceptance. Each success strengthened the case for rehabilitation projects. It showed that with careful methods, minimal contact, gradual rewilding, scientific monitoring, a cub raised by humans could still return to the wild. It also reminded everyone that conservation is not just about statistics. It is about stories that touch hearts and inspire action. River's survival was both a scientific data point and a symbol of possibility. Yet for Daniel, the story was not only about science. It was about the silence left behind when River walked into the forest. That silence was not empty. It was full of meaning, a reminder that the greatest measure of love is letting go. He often returned to the release site, standing at the edge of the clearing where the crate had opened. The forest always looked the same, but he imagined River somewhere beyond the trees, living the life he was meant to live. Conservation is not about ownership. It is about partnership. Humans can intervene, but the wild must ultimately take over. Our role is to prepare, then step back. The forest will do the rest. And now the story turns once more. River was no longer confined, dependent, no longer within the fences of the haven. He was part of the living landscape. For Daniel, that meant a new purpose too. Because letting go is not the end, it is the beginning of legacy. The next chapter would not be about holding River, but about ensuring that his story continued to inspire, to educate, and to transform the way humans saw the black bears of Appalachia. Months passed after River's release, and Daniel adjusted to the silence left behind. The forest felt different now. Every rustle of leaves, every paw print in the mud could have been Rivers, but Daniel resisted the urge to follow too closely. He trusted the GPS pings the camera trap photos, the quiet signals that River was alive and finding his place. Yet the absence was heavy. Caring for a black bear cub day and night had filled Daniel's life with purpose. Letting go had emptied his hands, but not his heart. Daniel found a new rhythm. He still walked patrols, still answered calls from hikers about bear sightings, still attended town meetings about coexistence. But now he carried River's story into every conversation. He spoke about how a mother bear once brought her weakest cub to the edge of human care, and how that cub survived not by losing his wildness, but by reclaiming it. People listened. Children leaned forward during school talks, their eyes wide. Farmers nodded slowly, seeing their own land through a new lens. River had become more than a cub. He was a symbol of possibility. To make sure that the symbol endured, Daniel and Emily established the River Bear Conservation Fund. Donations helped expand the Semi-Wild Haven Fund new GPS collars and support local research. Volunteers from nearby towns joined, offering time and resources. Some had once doubted the value of the project, but River's survival had shifted perspectives. They realized that protecting wildlife was not separate from community well-being. It was part of it. Healthy forests and thriving bear populations meant stronger ecosystems, cleaner water, and more balanced landscapes. Examples from beyond Appalachia reinforced this vision. In Alaska, grizzly sanctuaries had educated thousands about predator-prey dynamics. In Florida, panther rehabilitation has reduced conflicts with ranchers. Around the world, animal rescue stories showed that one life could ignite broader change. River's journey was Appalachia's chapter in that larger story, proof that even a single cub could influence conservation on a national scale. Daniel often reflected on the deeper lesson. Caring for River had taught him that love is not holding on. Love is preparing someone or something for independence, even when it breaks your own heart. It was the same lesson parents learn when children grow up and step into the world. It was the same truth teachers feel when students surpass them, or mentors when apprentices take flight. Letting go does not mean the bond disappears. It means the bond has done its work. Knowledge grew from this experience too. Researchers used River's GPS data to learn about bear movements, denning habits, and feeding strategies. Wildlife managers gained evidence that carefully raised cubs could survive in the wild without becoming dependent on humans. Policy discussions began about creating more semi-wild havens, modeled after the project Daniel and Emily built. What began as one cub's fight for survival was shaping scientific and political understanding across the region. Yet beyond science, the emotions stayed strongest. Daniel remembered the first time River's tiny heartbeat fluttered beneath his palm, the nights of doubt when survival seemed impossible, the pride and ache of watching him vanish into the forest. Those moments became part of his identity. They softened his grief for his son, transforming pain into purpose. They reminded him that healing does not erase loss, but it can build something enduring from it. There is a mystery here too. Did the mother bear know what she was doing when she placed River near humans? Was it desperation or instinct recognizing something deeper? We cannot answer, but perhaps that is the point. Not every act of love can be explained. Some are simply gestures of trust given without certainty, sustained by hope. For viewers, there is a reflection worth carrying. What does it mean to let go in your own life? Maybe it is allowing a child to make mistakes without interference. Maybe it is releasing control in a relationship. Maybe it is trusting that someone you guided is ready to walk without you. River's story shows that letting go is not abandonment. It is faith in resilience, faith that what you prepared for will endure beyond your reach. This fresh perspective reframes conservation itself. Too often we see it as saving animals for ourselves to watch, to admire, to photograph. But true conservation is about giving them back to the wild, unseen where they belong. Silence in the forest is not failure. It is a success, because silence means they are living without us. As Daniel sits on his porch at night, coffee in hand, he sometimes checks the latest GPS data. A dot moves slowly across the map, climbing ridges, crossing streams. He smiles, knowing River is still out there. He does not need to see him. The knowledge is enough. Legacy does not demand constant contact. Legacy lives in the freedom of those we release. And now I invite you to pause and consider your own story. Who or what in your life have you prepared, cared for, and then had to release? Where have you seen the courage of letting go? Transform into growth. River's journey is about black bears, wildlife, and animal rescue, but it is also about us. About the choices we make when holding on feels easier. But stepping back is necessary. If this story touched you, if River's survival reminded you of something in your own life, take a moment to reflect. And if you want to carry more stories like this about bears, about wild animals, about the quiet bridges between humans and nature, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can keep these stories alive, not only in words, but in actions that protect the wild for generations to come.